The periods when China's economy grew the fastest were precisely the times when its political climate was most relaxed. If it was the people who created the wealth, if it was the people who built the country, then on what grounds should they simply accept being ruled by the Communist Party, a party that came to power through violence and later implemented catastrophic policies that led to the death of tens of millions of people? Today, Xi Jinping provides that answer. We work and strive to actualize the great rejuvenation of the Chinese nation. The people need this answer. The Chinese are easy to govern. They won't rebel even if they starve to death. Paradoxically, Sir Keir Starmer, who may want to see China's rise up close, is shaking hands with the man who is, in fact, obstructing it. On the 28th of January, Sir Keir Starmer visited China, signaling his intention to steer the UK government toward a closer and more pragmatic relationship with Beijing. According to Chinese media summarizers of Starmer's earlier remarks, he has made his position very clear. China is no longer a rising power, it is a power that has already risen. He suggested that ignoring an economic power of this scale on the global stage would not serve Britain's own interests. That is why he believes the UK should pursue more practical cooperation with China based on an honest recognition of the world as it is. Yes, China's rise is indeed a fact that cannot be ignored. After all, online we can easily see vivid scenes of Chinese convenient daily life enabled by high technology, modern cities filled with skyscrapers, high-speed railways running across the country, shared bikes found almost everywhere, and even robot waiters taking orders in restaurants. Surrounded by these images, many young people have found themselves drifting toward a pro-China view, but often accompanied by two common misconceptions. They are, first, the belief that China's dictatorial system can also bring about socio-economic prosperity, and second, the assumption that China's current economic achievements should be credited to the Xi Jinping government now in power. This video will explain why both of these assumptions are wrong by taking a closer look at the governing path and policy direction of the Xi administration. First, let me be crystal clear. China's current socio-economic prosperity has almost nothing to do with the Xi Jinping government, and it certainly is not the result of the strict social control inherent in an authoritarian system. On the contrary, the periods when China's economy grew the fastest were precisely the times when its political climate was most relaxed. In recent years, not only has freedom of speech and the political environment been increasingly restricted, but this tightening has also had a conspicuous effect on the economy, namely a slowdown in growth. That said, China's population is so large that even if economic development were to stall completely, it would be impossible to see a significant downturn within just a few years. If we want to use an analogy, China is like a wealthy kid who inherited a fortune from his father, that is, the three leaders who ruled before Xi Jinping. It is fair to say that his father was hardworking, shrewd, and had a sharp business sense, but that doesn't prove the son has the same talent, nor that he will necessarily inherit his father's ambitions and follow the same path in life. Some might argue, however, that Xi was ultimately chosen by the CCP's older generation of leaders, and since they belong to the same circle of interests, he would likely continue their general policy direction. Explaining this properly requires a bit of background on the guiding principles set out by the previous generation of leaders. Before 1976, the CCP constantly followed Mao Zedong's approach, which placed ideological struggle above all else. But in 1978, when Deng Xiaoping regained power, he reversed that course. From then on, the party explicitly adopted the principle of economic development as the foundation, making the enrichment of the nation the CCP's primary goal. The two leaders who succeeded Deng both adhered to the path he had established. But did Xi Jinping, as the third leader after him, inherit this principle? Unfortunately, no. And it is precisely for this reason that China under Xi's rule from 2012 to the present represents a major political rupture from earlier periods. After Xi came to power, the priority of economic development was clearly abandoned. Instead, he introduced a new governing principle known as the Great Rejuvenation of the Chinese nation, also branded as the Chinese Dream. Put plainly, Xi believes that China's economy has already reached a level of considerable wealth and that the Chinese people should now concentrate on channeling their accumulated material wealth into what he sees as a higher and more spiritual pursuit, expanding China's influence on the world stage and shaping the image of a rising great power. At first glance, this goal sounds rather absurd. For any modern state, when government revenues increase, shouldn't the surplus be used to improve people's well-being? After all, China's standards in education, healthcare, and elder care still fall far short of those in developed countries. Logically, these areas should have been prioritized first rather than pouring money into so-called prestige projects aimed at enhancing China's international influence, the projects that are, in reality, deeply impractical. Regardless, Xi carried on ruling without concern for the people's happiness, and it must be said that his governing strategy shows a certain political sophistication. What it does, above all, is reframe the legitimacy of the party's rule. Next, I'm going to explain why. Over more than 4 decades of economic development, as people grew steadily wealthier, China gave rise to a new and expanding middle class. And if you have studied history, you will know this. The middle class is never a quiet or obedient group. Once people have money, their aspirations become more complicated, and this is especially true in China. As I mentioned earlier, for more than 40 years, the CCP promoted a governing principle that placed economic development at the center. After that, the ability to deliver economic growth gradually became a key measure of the government's competence, and even of the CCP's legitimacy to rule. But as people grew richer and better educated, some began to ask more fundamental questions. If it was the people who created the wealth, if it was the people who built the country, then on what grounds should they simply accept being ruled by the Communist Party, a party that came to power through violence and later implemented catastrophic policies that led to the death of tens of millions of people? So one example is Jack Ma, once China's richest man. Through his company's mobile payment technology, he transformed the daily lives of more than 1 billion people in China. Even the online direct-to-customer models now popular overseas like Temu can trace their roots back to systems he helped pioneer. Highly visible and outspoken, Jack Ma once believed that his extraordinary contributions to China's social and economic development entitled him to share, at least to some extent, in political power. In a public speech several years ago, he openly remarked that the Chinese government controlled too much and that policies should be loosened appropriately. Before Xi came to power, the CCP's strategy toward these non-compliant entrepreneurs and the middle class had been largely one of tolerance. As long as they did not turn their demands into explicit political movements, the party would generally leave them alone. Politicians understood that social development depended on the efforts of these people, so it was in their interest to keep them content. Under Xi, however, the situation changed dramatically. When it comes to economic development, the CCP officials naturally could not match entrepreneurs, middle class, or the workers who contributed physical labor when building infrastructure. But Xi gave the party a sense of ground historical mission through political propaganda. His logic was that this newly wealthy, power-seeking class cares only about money, a pursuit he considered lowly, even immoral. They lacked the understanding and commitment, as communists supposedly have, to shoulder the historical responsibilities of a Chinese citizen, namely achieving what he calls the Chinese dream. Therefore, power could of course not be shared with these people. It should remain firmly in the hands of the one truly noble and heroic actor, the Communist Party. In this way, the party claimed a moral legitimacy to continue ruling, while the newly wealthy would be forever excluded from political power. Jack Ma's speech occurred during Xi's tenure. Shortly afterward, his company's planned listing in the US was abruptly halted by the CCP, and Jack Ma himself has not appeared publicly since. Remember this truth: those who are absolutely unwilling to compromise on power often possess an exceptionally strong sense of morality, and some of the greatest evils in history have often been committed by people with the highest moral standards. Back to the point, this brings us to the change Xi Jinping has brought to the CCP. Before Xi, the party was a group of pragmatic politicians, and under Xi, he transformed it into a glorified, almost theocratic leadership body. Of course, such a morally sacred governing group must itself possess a high degree of moral integrity. That is why Xi could never tolerate corruption within the party, and why he has pursued his anti-corruption campaign with such relentless determination. But here's something you might not fully grasp. In China's one-party authoritarian system, economic development almost inevitably comes hand in hand with official corruption. In fact, the faster the economy grows, the more rampant corruption tends to become. It is built into the system itself. That is why the leaders before Xi generally turned a blind eye to corruption. They had to find a delicate balance between fostering economic growth and tolerating official misconduct. Xi's tireless crackdown on corruption, however, shows once again that what he cares about most is the moral purity of the party as a whole. Economic development, by contrast, has been pushed completely to the background. As a result, the party's moral and sacred authority gradually replaced its ability to deliver economic growth as the highest standard for judging its legitimacy to rule. Another perhaps unexpected benefit of Xi's seemingly unreasonable turn is that it won him broad support among the Chinese people. Indeed, Xi is extremely popular among the public. His level of popularity far surpasses that of his predecessors Hu Jintao and Jiang Zemin. The Chinese people are in some ways eccentric. Chen Yun, Deng's important political partner, once summed up their character in a very blunt way: the Chinese are easy to govern, they won't rebel even if they starve to death. But this actually reflects a critical truth that the Chinese do not see meeting their basic survival needs as a responsibility that falls on the government. Even today, most Chinese do not take it for granted that the government has an obligation to improve welfare in areas such as education, healthcare, or pensions. In fact, the Chinese are quite insensitive to the government's welfare policies. This is rooted in a long-standing tradition. In Chinese society, basic needs are usually not borne by the individual alone, but by the family as a whole. It is common for parents to borrow money from other relatives, sometimes even distant ones, to pay for their children's education tuition. If someone becomes wealthy, all of their family members, even those they have never met before, may turn to them for financial support. The expectation is that one has a duty to contribute resources to improve the living standards of the entire family. In this context, much of what would normally be considered the government's responsibility for social welfare is effectively absorbed by the traditional practice of family members taking care of each other. With the family already shouldering much of the social responsibilities that the government would normally be expected to provide, what more do the people need from the state? One could argue that for more than 40 years, this question went largely unanswered. But today, Xi Jinping has provided an almost perfect answer. What the government must provide to people is belief. To give some historical context, in the 1960s, China under Mao launched a social movement called the Cultural Revolution. During the period, the people stirred up by Mao almost entirely stigmatized all religions. Temples and churches were severely damaged, and anyone who openly practiced a faith faced discrimination and persecution. Later, in the 1990s, a homegrown spiritual movement called Falun Gong emerged in China, and its practitioners were also persecuted by the CCP, with many forced into exile. These two crises of faith left the majority of Chinese people as atheists. Yet I have increasingly noticed that many Chinese people around me who identify as atheists or materialists are often not claiming to have a firm belief that life has no ultimate purpose. Rather, they are expressing a form of skepticism, a suspended, unsettled state, an urgent longing to find meaning and purpose in life. During China's last 40 years of rapid economic growth, the people worked with extraordinary efforts, seizing every opportunity to earn money, yet they never had a chance to understand the ultimate reason behind their labor. Today, Xi Jinping provides that answer. We work and strive to actualize the great rejuvenation of the Chinese nation. The people need this answer. They need to know that all their past efforts were directed toward a grand and noble purpose. For Chinese who have long lacked a clear faith, this sense of purpose is profoundly important, arguably far more important than improving current welfare or material living standards. By comparison, basic political rights such as freedom of speech become almost completely irrelevant. Imagine someone who discovered that their life has a grand ultimate purpose. Achieving it brings more joy than ascending to heaven. If such pursuit requires them to give up freedom of speech, would they hesitate? Of course not. Without exaggeration, they might even be willing to give up their life for it. It's similar to how many of today's young Chinese nationalists loudly proclaim their readiness to die for a military invasion of Taiwan. But this is a kind of alienation. Those who support Xi are actively asking an outsider, even a politician, to impose limits on their own lives. This is wrong, as only the individual can truly decide the course of their own life. And I believe it is a miracle that I can control the body I inhabit and it is not subject to the will of others. So I simply don't let others interfere. I value my body and mind, and I want them to continue functioning as nature intended, guided solely by my own will. That is why I understand the importance of freedom of speech. Perhaps the reverse is also true. Those who do not cherish freedom of speech are, in fact, failing to respect their own value. Under my video discussing young people in China, one of Xi's supporters commented that literally his own morality and ability do not measure up Xi's. It made me feel a trace of pity for him, since he actually went so far as to publicly belittle himself to show his support for another mortal being just like himself. And I know that many of Xi Jinping's supporters share the same mindset. Perhaps this is also connected to Chinese traditional culture, where self-deprecation is often interpreted as a form of humility, a virtue. Humility may indeed be a virtue, but self-deprecation is not. It is merely a form of timidity in the face of a domineering dictator. That is why, as I have said before, opposing the CCP must involve an attitude of encouragement. Anti-CCP work is not a no-saying campaign, it is a yes-saying campaign. It must encourage others to recognize and affirm their value as individuals. Only then will they have the strength to resist a powerful government that has blatantly disrespected individuals. So back to the point, I just want Gen Zs who are increasingly pro-China to see the political rupture that exists between the China of Xi's era and the China that came before him. Please don't mistakenly credit China's current achievements to Xi's government or even to the CCP. The people who truly contributed to China's economic development, like Jack Ma, have now been silenced by the government. And the workers who physically built the country because their labor rights are not protected are often still running around trying to collect wages onto them by their bosses. I'm confident that Sir Keir Starmer, as leader of the Labour Party, knows full well that China's so-called rise was built brick by countless workers on construction sites. Yet the man he shook hands with, dressed in suit and tie, is the very person who suppresses workers' basic rights by steadily tightening China's restrictions on freedom of speech, making it impossible for them to publicly complain or protest against injustice. Paradoxically, Sir Keir Starmer, who may want to see China's rise up close, is shaking hands with the man who is, in fact, obstructing it. With that man and his political clique guiding him, he visited the Forbidden City, Tiananmen Square, witnessing firsthand the lavish lifestyle of China's top leaders, who claim to be the working class, the so-called proletariat. Of course, there's nothing wrong with it if it's only a matter of entertaining an honored guest. But just don't forget the people who truly made China's rise possible. The factory workers living in collective dormitories, 6 people per room, rural to urban workers who leave their children in the countryside for most of the year with little care, workers who labor 12 hours a day only to risk having their wages withheld, delivery drivers speeding recklessly on the road to avoid late order fines. Don't ignore them, meet them up, talk to them, let them speak up, listen closely to their voice, and this is the real story of China's rise. Okay, that's all for this video. I hope you like this video, and I will see you next time. Have a good day. Bye bye.